this topic is very, very dear to my heart. It's very, very important to me. The realizations that I had, the initial awakenings almost that I received around this topic around 6 years ago started me off on a lot of my spiritual practices and my astrological practice too. In many ways, this talk that I'm giving now is the culmination of 6 years of research. It began for me as I returned to Plato with fresh eyes when I was still an undergraduate. And I had studied him through a particular lens, a particular hermeneutical viewpoint that academic philosophers gave me, mostly atheistic academic philosophers. And eventually some things clicked for me and I began studying Plato on his own terms. And after I studied mysticism and spiritual practice and other traditions, it finally dawned on me that Plato was a mystic and a spiritual practitioner, one who had descended and learned from other mystics and was in turn influenced, who in turn influenced other mystics later on, including other astrologers. Amongst other things, Plato writes about spiritual practices, and he talks about asceticism and denying the needs of the body in order to reach mystic states, something that people who practice yoga and meditation are very familiar with. And along those lines, he also speaks of things like enlightenment and union with something higher than us. And to get really woo with it, Plato is our only source for the story of the fall of Atlantis. The story, it shows up in the Timaeus, which we're going to be working with a lot in this presentation. It doesn't show up anywhere else. We wouldn't know about Atlantis if it wasn't for Plato actually writing about it. And amongst other things too, he talks about heavenly realms. He does talk about astrology. We'll be talking about that quite a bit. And finally, he talks at length about reincarnation. So in short, he is not really a philosopher, as many people today would think of the word philosopher. He's not an armchair intellectual trying to define the meaning of the word meaning, or trying to convince their neighbors that they can't really know whether or not they're dreaming or actually just a brain sitting in a vat experiencing nothing. It's not that theoretical and abstract. Philosophers today will talk to you about how the practice of philosophy makes you think better. They don't talk about how the practice of philosophy can help your soul reascend to the realm of the gods. Plato does. Philosophers today will talk about knowledge and how we know what we know. Plato talks about awakening the eye of the soul to behold true reality. And just even like that kind of language is very mystical, it's very contemplative, it's very spiritual in its focus. That gets kind of brushed aside. And I wanted, for our lecture today, I really want people to bracket everything that you think you know about Plato. This is not a philosopher, a fuddy-duddy philosopher in the way that we're generally conditioned to think of him. I'm hoping to be able to give people an understanding and an insight into Plato as I was able to see him first 6 years ago, when I discovered his true status as a mystic and as a sage, as a link in this golden chain of spiritual practitioners and human beings seeking enlightenment and seeking something higher. I had to pick this study up and put it down several times. Some of the explicit links and connections that I'm going to be talking about here, I only made in the last 6 months. And on a deeper note, part of me wonders if I actually had to be ready to fully understand it. So the astrological community is really starting to take notice of this as well, this idea that Plato was a deep mystic and perhaps even responsible for a lot of astrological doctrines. It's a very, very hot topic right now. There's a lot of interest in showing how classical astrology itself may even be birthed directly from Platonism, or even came directly out of the Platonic Academy, perhaps even from the mind of Plato himself. There's a great advantage, or you think a reward to this kind of study, this investigation, if you can actually successfully ground it in Platonism, because it takes astrology from, it takes astrology out of the perspective that it's something like, like very, very new agey, like just pure sun-sign newspaper, column pop culture, schlock astrology, into something that is actually a spiritual practice grounded in ancient wisdom, and something that can really practically liberate your soul from materiality and show you what kind of life you're going to have as well. It gives astrology a pedigree. So it's very understandable that people would be interested in that. It's also just a very, very exciting idea. The possibility that Western astrology is rooted in a lineage and an ancient tradition. It's part of a golden thread of famous mystics throughout the history of Western esotericism, and not just a recent revival of something that was couched in 20th century theosophical concepts. So to make explicit the thesis that a lot of astrologers nowadays are kind of pushing for, is that the classical astrology as a practice, or Hellenistic astrology as a practice, developed somehow out of the Platonic current, whether that just means Platonism in general, or the Platonic school, or even out of the mind of Plato himself. And some people I know who have really talked about this a lot include Nick Campion, James Holden, and I think Robert Schmidt would be the big name that really, really pushed for this, really saw this as a genuine possibility. Now, I actually see a slight problem with this, and I do want to make it clear right off the bat that I don't necessarily see the Plato himself as having invented classical astrology, and nor do I think that classical astrology was invented or developed by anyone coming out of the Platonic tradition. There's two main issues with this. The first is that it's very, very difficult to prove. I had a lot of trouble trying to make this happen, make this work. To prove it, you would have to do two things. You would first need to trace the majority of classical astrological doctrines back to the Platonic corpus or to other later Platonists, which you can definitely do some of them, and we're going to talk a little bit about the ones that you can demonstrate, but a lot of them you can't. It's very, very difficult, or at least the texts that have them haven't survived. And second, you would have to show that Plato himself wasn't cribbing off of other people, that it was actually this unique idea that to Plato that didn't show up before him. And while you might be able to do the first one, the second one is very, very hard to do because, as I'm going to try and show, Plato himself was actually cribbing off of other people. The discipline, and more important, the philosophy and the worldview of astrology is actually far older than the Platonic Academy. The astrological themes in Plato manifest because he was drawing on an astrological worldview to inform his own philosophical positions. In other words, I think that we're thinking about it a little bit backwards. To say that astrology descends from Platonism or the Platonic Academy kind of puts the cart before the horse. Plato is drawing on astrological and even proto-astrological themes in order to bolster his own philosophical position. He relies on astrologers, and later astrologers reflect Platonic themes because they were already astrological to begin with. So a lot of people, very simplistic model where Plato or Platonism births Hellenistic astrology. And throughout this talk, I'm actually going to be arguing for something kind of like this model, where at the top we have the font of the current, the font of the wisdom. We have astrological mystery traditions that influence Plato, who in turn influences Hellenistic astrology. And then, the astrological mystery traditions independent of Plato also continue to influence and birth Hellenistic astrology as well. Kind of, that's what this big arrow is indicating right here. In short, Plato is downstream of astrologers, not the other way around. And I think that ultimately this is a much more exciting, fascinating thesis as well. I think it's actually what astrologers want deep down. Not just for astrology to be rooted in a particular philosophical school, like Platonism, but to be verifiably related and descended from a long line of mystical thinkers to which people like Plato are actually indebted. That's, to me, is a lot cooler. And as I'll be showing, we can trace this all the way back to ancient Egypt. And that is your pedigree. that is your source as an astrologer. It goes all the way back to, at least astrology is a spiritual practice, so like horoscopy even is rooted in ancient Egyptian practice, and much, much older, much more epic, a lot cooler than just being rooted in Platonism. So this is my thesis. The philosophy of Platonism developed out of astrological mystery traditions. And as I kind of argue for this, you'll see what specifically, and you'll see some examples of what I mean by astrological mystery traditions too. That'll get clear as we go along. So where we're going here, here's a brief roadmap. First, I'm going to make explicit the astrological and Platonic overlap. This is laying the groundwork to show that, it's worth it at all to try and root astrology in something deeper than actual Hellenistic practice, but to show that it goes further than that. I'm going to be showing astrological themes that are present within the Platonic corpus, and then also showing Platonic themes that show up in the astrological corpus, and going both ways to really kind of cinch these two schools of thought together. I'm not going to be trying to prove anything per se. That would require a book. What I'm going to be giving you is more of a survey, something that is intimating, and at least maybe perhaps you could describe what I'm giving you as like a burden of proof, or enough evidence to consider the possibility. And from that, I'm going to get into the really juicy stuff and talking about Plato's place in a much older lineage of mystery schools that talk a lot about ancient star knowledge, ancient astrological knowledge. And with that narrative in mind, I'm going to give a definition of astrology, that astrology is a practical philosophy, specifically a practical philosophy for a cosmology that you could call like Hermeticism, or some kind of ancient Egyptian mystery tradition. And from that, we'll provide some takeaways for how astrologers should comport themselves, and the credence and almost dignity, gravitas, that they should give themselves as they practice their craft, which is really what we're going for here. Okay. So a lot of it comes when starting with the astrological themes that show up in Plato. A lot of it comes down to Plato's Timaeus. So I'm having a technical issue here. 1 second. Yeah. A lot of it comes down to Plato's Timaeus. It's the source for a lot of the explicit references that we see to Platonism, to astrology and Platonism. Plato's Timaeus includes a very, very beautiful narration of the world. We have in the Timaeus this demiurge figure, a creator, kind of a craftsman deity. A comparison would be like Atum in ancient Egypt. We'll see some references to Atum. And this demiurge creator divides the universe outside of the Earth into 8 concentric spheres. 1 sphere for each of the planets, and then a sphere for the fixed stars. That's the 8th one at the top. And these planets are assigned the role of administrators of fate and fortune. They create and they represent time. In some way, they actually are literally time, but it gets very, very closely related to it. And multiple times in the Timaeus, Plato specifically refers to them as gods. Plato also describes human beings as emanations from the fixed stars that have descended into the world through these spheres of the planets. And I want you to put a pin in this idea that our souls, our spirits, descend or emanate down into this earth from the realm of the fixed stars, as it's going to show up quite a bit later on. Here's a really juicy passage from 42c through d of Plato's Timaeus. He says, but the cycles of the planets, they are crossing over each other, the manner of their retrogradations, the conjunctions and oppositions of these deities, they're another reference to calling the planets gods, how they eclipse each other, their heliacal risings and settings, how all this sends portents of things to come to those who are not able to reason. To speak of any of this without the use of visual models of their motions would be a toil. So I want to break this down bit by bit. First off, at the beginning, He goes through a list of pretty specific astrological techniques. We've got retrogradations. We have a reference to combustion, things being eclipsed. Phasis, that's the heliacal risings and settings, where a planet gets within 15 to 20 degrees of the sun on either side, and they suddenly appear after being invisible for a while, or they suddenly disappear after being visible for a while. And conjunctions and oppositions too, which when I saw this and I looked at it, my heart kind of skipped a beat. There's one thing to talk about, like, yes, the planets are gods, and isn't that cool? It's another thing entirely to actually see a reference to something like conjunctions and then even oppositions. That is a very technical astrological tool that you would only use and pay attention to if you're actually interested in the practice of astrology. So he kind of gives himself away here, and it's kind of exciting. And even retrogradations and combustion as well. That's kind of a big deal. That's that goes a step beyond just being purely theoretical in my mind. That goes into something deeper. And then how he says how all this sends portents of things to come to those who are not able to reason. You kind of take this apart into two different segments. The first is that these planets do in fact send portents of things to come. They predict the future in some way. Now he specifies and says that it's to those who aren't able to reason. And throughout the Platonic Corpus, he talks about how being able to reason, being able to think, being able to do philosophy elevates you above the material world in some way. So it's a kind of similar perspective that you see in some yogic traditions, that by doing spiritual practice, by meditating, or by doing philosophy, specifically Jnana yoga, you would somehow be able to liberate yourself from the cycles of the planets and no longer be affected by them. You also see it in some of the ancient Christian doctrines where the act of being baptized saves you from the planets. The planets do have an effect, but they, by doing a particular spiritual practice, you're not under their influence anymore. But in any case, he's definitely saying that they can affect you. And then this I thought was really cool. He's talking about visual models. He says that here that, it's not any use trying to talk about any of this stuff without visual models, but the fact that he's even referencing visual models as being kind of on the table, no pun intended, indicates that he would have used visual models before. And clearly the stars and the planets were important enough in the Platonic Academy that he would have had visual models and images, maybe even natal charts of the planets set up that he used in order to teach astronomy and possibly even astrology. So that's the Timaeus, and in my mind, that kind of seals the deal for me. Especially the talk about conjunctions and oppositions, but I do want to flesh it out a little bit more because I think it'll be important later as we talk about some of the deeper mystical current of which Plato is a part. And for that, I want to turn to the Phaedrus and the soul chariots that are mentioned in the Phaedrus. So Plato, or Socrates specifically, gives this beautiful metaphor in the Phaedrus of how human beings are these chariots. The soul of a human being is a chariot that is running in a circular race course along the sky, right next to the gods and all of the divinities. But unfortunately for us poor human beings, one of the horses that controls our chariots is a little bit unruly. It's a little bit restless, and it bucks, and it's hard to get a handle on it and control. And so inevitably, humanity, they lose control of this horse. They lose control of their chariot, and they fall out of the circular race course that circles around the earth, and they kind of plunge down into the earth. And in the process, our wings are burnt. And the practice of philosophy, you could even say the spiritual discipline of philosophy, is something that regrows our wings so that we can ascend back up to the sky. So in my mind, the circular course of souls and gods and chariots is clearly a metaphor for the planets and stars coursing through the heavens around the earth. I mean, it's very, very easy to think of the planets as being chariots circling the earth already. It is like a circular race course. And a lot of the iconography around Helios and Apollo that describes him as actually being in a chariot. So the sun in traditional classical Greek mythology already has a chariot. So it's just kind of applying that to other planets as well. And then the descent of the soul onto the earth is the same descent of the soul from the stars that we saw in the Timaeus. And then the regrowth of the wings to return the soul back into the regrowth of the wings allows you to be able to return back up into the realm of the heavens after you die. And that's really why you do philosophy. You don't do philosophy to learn how to think better or to learn how to bug your neighbors about whether or not he knows that he can feel his underwear. You do philosophy for like a very, very deep reason of being able to go back home when you die. Philosophy is the preparation for death. And, you know, some other spiritual practice, like when we think of things that prepare you for death, we think of like prayer and yoga and yogic asanas and meditation and breath work. These are also things that are meant to prepare the soul for death when it dies. That's it's much different than how we think about philosophy now, but it tells you what Plato is using, like what concept of philosophy Plato is using when he actually uses that term. It's something that is spiritual in its focus. And then lastly, in terms of text that I want to like go specifically with Plato here, I want to look at the Epinomis. This is what academics call a spurious dialogue, which means that Plato might not have written it. And the only reason academics say that Plato might not have written it is because it's way too spiritual, and heaven forbid that Plato was not just an atheist philosopher like they are. But even if it was spurious, it just shows that someone like a descendant of Plato was just as interested in astrology as Plato was, and that could actually strengthen my case and strengthen the case for astrologers too. So either way, it's kind of a win-win for us. And here's a beautiful quote. The whole text, the Epinomis, is just gorgeous, like eye-watering, beautiful. And he says that either the signs are themselves gods, and it is perfectly appropriate to celebrate them in hymns, or we must suppose them to be the likenesses of gods, something like images of them made by the gods themselves. So this it almost reminds me of like a bhakti yoga or something, the way that Plato is talking, or one of Plato's students is talking about the planets and the signs here. It seems there's a lot of reverence, there's a lot of awe, and I think that that really gets at the approach that Plato is using when he is talking about the planets, at least how he felt about the planets and the signs and felt about astrology is like is this sort of spiritual, emotive connection even. Okay, so that's the sort of the first part. That, in my mind, that pretty clearly shows that there's astrological themes in the Platonic corpus. It's pretty straightforward. You could go a lot deeper with it, but you know, again, like I said, this is just a survey to kind of get you excited and even like get you wanting more and to go and do some research on your own as well. So that's also the easy part, all things considered, because you know clearly Plato is talking a lot about astrology. But there isn't there aren't a whole lot of references to philosophy within astrologers. There isn't a single astrologer that I know of early enough in the tradition, like early enough in the tradition being like, you know, 1st century CE, that mentions Plato explicitly, not a single one. Or other philosophers really. It's generally astrologers talking about other astrologers. At least any such texts that do have not been uncovered. We need to remember that history is the remembered past, and you know, there's always more that could be found, more that we could recover later on. So we do need to read between the lines a lot and work more on some intimations and suggestions, and also bring in what we know outside of the text as well. So I want to kind of start big picture with Robert Schmidt. Robert Schmidt was the juggernaut of philosophical astrology and very, very dedicated to this entire idea. I think that the first person to not suggest, but really, really push for this was Robert Schmidt, and is very, very intent on demonstrating how the function of astrology fits squarely within the conceptual model of Platonism. In other words, given that the Platonic model of the universe can explain and ground every feature, aspect, and technique of astrology, it had to be intentional. It had to be causal. There had to be a link in some way. And he spent a lot of time really trying to argue for this. Reportedly, Robert Schmidt would lie awake at night with this unshakable feeling that it could not have been any other way, that it had to have been developed by people in the Platonic Academy. And he ended up towards the later portion of his life really arguing that it was Eudoxus, who was one of Plato's students, that actually developed astrology. Now, as we'll see, I don't completely agree with him on that part, but it does show how dedicated he was and how much he believed this position. So here's a abbreviated list, abridged list of all the different things that Robert Schmidt tried to directly ground within the Platonic cosmology and the Platonic philosophy. And he has dozens and dozens and dozens of hours of recorded lectures where he is talking about this in detail. And it is all worth listening to. It will all really open your mind and get you to view astrology as a practice a lot differently. For our purposes here, I'm just going to be seeing and showing how you can do this with sect and the meanings of the planets. And he talks about this some in the lecture, The Same and the Other, and then a little bit more in the Hermes course, the 4-part Hermes course that he did as well, which are, I think, all available for recording on projecthindsight.com. So he grounds the nature of the planets within the primary and secondary motion of Plato. And I think probably most people here are familiar with the primary and secondary motion, being astrologers. And just in case, the primary motion that Plato talks about in the Timaeus is the diurnal rotation of the Earth. So, all the planets, all the stars, all the and the sun itself, it all rises up in the east and it sets in the west. And it does that constantly, continuously, always at the same rate, always at the same speed. It never changes. It's constant. And this is one of the motions that Plato's demiurge creates in the world right before he actually makes the planets. So that's what it is astronomically. Philosophically, the primary motion becomes associated with oneness and absolutes and the world of the forms, things that, like the heavenly realms, things that are permanent and stable and absolute, like God and the divine and the life beyond death and this kind of thing. That's the primary motion. And then there's the secondary motion, which is the motion of the planets through the zodiac. So all the planets rise up in the east and they set in the west, and that's the movement through the houses, so that they start in the east in the ascendant and then they move up into the 10th house. But opposite that, like you go from Leo to Virgo to Libra to Scorpio, and that pushes against the movement through the houses. That goes in a different direction. So there's this sense in which the planets are fighting that oneness, they're fighting that unity. And through doing so, they're creating difference, they're creating separation, they're creating the material world. The reason that we aren't all, blissfully, statically living in the world of the forms right now, or in complete union with the divine, is because the planets are there creating this space for separation by fighting against the primary motion. And so philosophically, the secondary motion of the planets is associated with difference and with uniqueness and separation and even forgetting and forgetfulness. So Robert Schmidt roots the sun with the primary motion and the moon with the secondary motion. And actually, the sun is the monad, it's the absolute, it's the stasis. It is always constantly shining at the same rate. And the sun defines the diurnal rotation. The sun that primarily rises up in the east and sets in the west. So then the moon is associated with the secondary motion. The moon is dyadic. While the sun is absolute and fixed and permanent, the moon moves at different rates. The moon waxes and then it wanes. And the moon is therefore associated with multiplicity. And you can actually, Robert Schmidt will argue, you can ground all of the 5 classical planets proper within these motions. So Jupiter and Venus represent the sort of parts of these motions that we like. So on the side of unity and absolute, we have Jupiter being a benefic planet associated with things like consciousness, growth and expansion, raising and elevating the spirit, light, wisdom, also finances, but finances that are a little bit more immaterial, investments, revenue, abundance, capital streams, things that you can't touch. So like we associate Jupiter with money, but it's more like your income. You can't touch your income. I can touch a gold coin or a copper coin, which is more Venusian, but I can't touch a stock portfolio. So, and then, yeah, Venus is material goods. Venus is the benefic planet of the secondary motion of materiality. And that's why Venus rules art. Because, you know, again, this is a dyadic planet. It's of the nighttime sect. So Venus is associated with anything that involves a multitude. And beauty in the Greek mind is a matter of proportionality. And proportionality is always a function of multiple things. So two notes that you play on a piano or that you play on a lyre that complement each other, they're harmonious because it's two things that get along. It's not the like one individual wisdom of Jupiter. It's something that's kind of outside and external to you. It's also sex, which involves two people coming together, and it's material goods, copper coins, nice food, things, good things of the body. And then the malefics are the parts of their respective motions that we don't like. So the sun is the diurnal motion, it's consciousness, and then Saturn is the parts of like consciousness and oneness that we do not like. So Saturn is mental angst, anguish, depression, loss, dark nights of the soul, death, grief, confusion, ignorance, things, pains, malefic qualities that you can't necessarily touch. They're a little bit more intangible. And then Mars on the other side rules cuts and burns, rape, fights, murder, injury, illness, things that affect your body. You know, I can touch a cut, I can touch a burn, and that's why Mars is on the side of the secondary motion, which is associated with separation and materiality in the body. But Saturn, being more ethereal and abstract on the side of the primary motion, is more abstract. I can't touch depression. I can't touch a dark night of the soul. I can feel a dark night of the soul, but I can't touch it. It's not a physical thing. And then Mercury is the kind of, the last one is a sort of physical instantiation of the demiurge or the logos, which also does make sense from a Gnostic or a spiritual perspective. Many Gnostics equate Christ as kind of identical to Hermes Trismegistus, the founder of astrology. And the logos, the word, is that which unites, that which bridges two different things. And also ultimately that which saves us by bringing us out of the world of materiality, see, world of materiality being the side of the moon, and pulls us into the realm of the spirit with the sun. Lots of figures do this. Christ also Hecate does this in the Chaldean oracles. You could even argue that Hermes Trismegistus does this within Hermeticism and in the Hermetica, that he's a kind of a bridge between the material world into the world of the spirit. So this whole model also shows up very clearly in the scheme of the planetary choice, where the daytime planets, the ones that are associated with the primary motion of the diurnal rotation of the sun, are all up in the diurnal hemisphere. And we have the sun in the house of the god, and then we have Jupiter being in the house of good spirit. This is like a reason why they would have called this house the house of good spirit. It's because it's the goods associated with the spiritual life, the goods associated with the primary motion. Right next to Saturn in the 12th house, which is the house of bad spirit, things of the spiritual world that we do not like, dark nights of the soul, self-undoing, as opposed to friends and allies and hopes and dreams and aspirations of the 11th. And then these two benefics, these two planets of the daytime sect are opposed to the two planets of the nighttime sect, which are in the nighttime hemisphere. And here we have Venus in the house of good fortune, the goods of materiality. And then we have Mars in the house of evil or bad fortune, and associated with illness and injury and bad things that happen to your body, as opposed to bad things that happen to your mind in the 12th. And then opposite the sun god, we have the moon goddess, in the same half as the other two nighttime planets. And then naturally we have Mercury in the middle, bridging these two worlds. Mercury is right in the horoscopos, and I think it's something in Hermeticism, in the Hermetica, Corpus Hermeticum, where the spirit of the human individual flies through the eastern horizon when it comes into the world. And that's where the spirit and the body are merged together so that experience on the earth is possible. And Mercury sits there in the first house, kind of presiding over that process, presiding over that uniting. So because it's so similar, and because you can root all the meanings of the 7 planets pretty architectonically, pretty rigorously within these 2 motions within Plato, Robert Schmidt would say that this had to be intentional. So in sum, it's like the noetic self, the demiurge of the Timaeus, Atum, an Egyptian mindset that creates the primary motion and the secondary motion, and then you have one luminary assigned to each motion, and then you have a good planet and a bad planet to represent each side of the primary and secondary motion, something we like and then something we don't. And then Mercury relates these 2 together. And from that, it's Platonic cosmology leads to astrological practice, like very straightforward. And Robert Schmidt goes to great pains to try and show how you can do this with not just the planets, but also the signs, the houses, aspects, time lords, triplicities, everything. And it is a pretty compelling case, just for how similar it is, just how well they mesh, how well they work together. I will say that I also use this definition, use this understanding of the planets in all of my with all my clients that I see, and also with all of the webinars and the lectures that I give, and I found it to be extremely effective on a practical level, which ultimately, as a practicing astrologer, that's what actually matters, is that I can use this understanding of the planets to great effect. It really, really works. It really, really resonates with my clients, and I like the simplicity of it. It's very clean. I like the straight lines, and my clients do too. So that is also a point in favor of this. And it does make me wonder, like, was this intentional? Was this kind of on purpose with the founders of astrology? So moving on to that, let's actually look at a specific astrologer that does generate some Platonic themes, or does indicate there's some possibilities, some overlap here. And that is Antiochus of Athens. Antiochus of Athens is our source for much of the Hellenistic aspect doctrine, and also much of the confusion, argument, and intense debate around the Hellenistic aspect doctrine too. So if you're familiar with different levels of orbs in aspects, like 3 different levels of orbs, and then if you've heard of spear bearing and casting rays, actinobalia, this all comes from Antiochus. He's our source for this. Now there's good reason to believe that Antiochus of Athens was actually a man named Antiochus of Ascalon, who was the founder of Middle Platonism. Okay, so if this is true, then we have someone in the Platonic Academy actually writing a text, which again is very, very specific. That's a lot different than talking about how, the planets are God. Isn't that cool, man? That's much different from actually writing about aspects and using aspects at a practical level. This was originally suggested by Franz Cumont, who was a Belgian classicist. He said it was a possibility, it made sense to him. And Robert Schmidt also at first was kind of critical of this, but then eventually came to believe it quite strongly. And I agree as well. I think it's quite possible. There's 2 main reasons. First is that the text does have a decidedly Platonic tone. The text does use some Platonic concepts to explain different techniques, especially exaltations and rulerships. It's He goes that length to explain why the rulership scheme in astrology and the exaltation scheme in astrology is the way that it is. And it's very fascinating. It's a very interesting read. And there's lots of notion of polarity and light and dark and like life and death that is very Platonic and definitely shows a lot of overlap with Middle Platonism too. It is also just kind of a felt thing. Like if you read a lot of Plato and you go and you read the Thesaurus by Antiochus of Athens, it kind of feels similar. It feels like it's coming out of the same current, and that's not like a rational argument per se. But I think that, clearly, like other people who read quite a bit of Plato, including Franz Cumont and Robert Schmidt, came to the same conclusion, which I definitely do think is a point in its favor, if nothing else. And then the second reason that I would consider Antiochus of Athens to actually have been Antiochus of Ascalon is that our most complete source for him, we talk a lot in classics about like extant copies, and there will be like multiple instances of the same text as different scribes copied it down. And our most complete, fullest source for Antiochus of Athens, the thesaurus that he wrote, comes from Porphyry, who is a Hellenistic astrologer and was also one of the archons, one of the heads of the Neoplatonic school of astrology. And people accuse him of plagiarizing, but philosophers don't plagiarize. That's not what they do, especially not heads of the Platonic Academy. That's really bad form. So he is also, in his version of the Antiochus summary, he's also very clearly trying to clarify and explain and unpack some more difficult concepts that aren't explained within other extant, perhaps older copies of it. So it seems very possible to me that Porphyry was working with a manuscript that was actually passed down within the school, and he didn't feel the need to cite it. So Antiochus of Ascalon, or Antiochus of Athens, writes this text in the 1st century BC, and it is handed down from archon to archon to use to teach members of the Neoplatonic school, students in the Neoplatonic school, about astrology. And then eventually, 300 years go by, and Porphyry says, I need to kind of change this up. I need to re-clarify this for people because 300 years have gone by. That's the time difference between us and somebody who is writing in 1721. That's a long time. So he clarifies it. He gives it to make more sense, and because it's a text that belongs to the Platonic Academy, he doesn't need to cite it. Everybody knows that it's a text that's just being passed down from archon to archon. That'll explain why, and someone with a lot of respect as the leader of the most reputable school of philosophy in the ancient world wouldn't cite a source, which is a big no-no back then, just as it is now. So let's go to Manilius too. We got two more astrologers to go through, and then we're going to get into some of the really meaty stuff of ancient mystery traditions. So Manilius, a lot of people kind of poo-poo on Manilius because he's accused of being deviant from the general astrological tradition, and he certainly is pretty deviant in some ways. But people also don't think about how much he's actually similar to this tradition. He's not working with Phaedrus, for instance. And he's still using aspects and masculine and feminine signs, and it's just there's more that's similar with Manilius than there is separate. And so also you kind of have to use him because he's our earliest complete source. He writes 150 years before Ptolemy. He's the only one that hasn't survived just in quotation or in a fragmentary form. And he is also our only source that has survived that deals with philosophy outright. Again, most astrologers, they're practical people. They don't really need to write about philosophy quite as much, so you have to read between the lines. But Manilius does write quite a bit about philosophy, so we have to use him, especially considering how early he is. His philosophy is also oftentimes categorized as being Stoic, but he never uses the term Stoicism. He never refers to himself as a Stoic either. A lot of the things that he says that are categorized as being Stoic could also just as easily be Platonic. Again, there's compared to worldviews today, there's a lot more similarity between Stoicism and Platonism than there is different, especially in really, really early Stoicism in the cosmology. So, first off, within Manilius, in the Astronomicon of Manilius, there's a lot of overlap with the Phaedrus Manilius also uses this same extended metaphor of his soul being a chariot that goes up into the stars to fly alongside the planets and get a sense for what it is that they're all about. To me, that's very, very clear. You don't just start thinking about the soul as a chariot. That's not like something you wake up to one day and be like, maybe the soul's a chariot. Unless you're Socrates, unless you're like a really cool person. So to me, Manilius was a highly educated individual, so he would have read the Phaedrus, and he obviously thought that it was important enough to utilize that metaphor in his own astronomical treatise. So I think he's clearly cribbing off Plato in using that metaphor. There's also a lot of overlap in the Timaeus. The Timaeus talks about how the world is, how the demiurge takes the 4 different elements and composes them together in order to create the world that we live in now. And there's these descriptions of how the demiurge is kind of, like within and without the 4 elements, constantly like moving them around to get everything where it needs to be, kind of like guiding the material creation at all levels all the time. It's very interesting. It's very poetic. And Manilius uses the same kind of language. One thing that I didn't mention earlier with the Timaeus is that there's this story of Phaethon, and Phaethon was the original poetic name for the planet Jupiter. It means like the brilliant one, or the radiant one. And there's this story that Plato gives in the Timaeus of how the sun, Helios, kind of gives over the reins of his chariot to Phaethon and allows him to drive it through the sky. And in doing so, he burns up the entire earth because he gets way too close, and it's a disaster. And then so after everything falls apart, except for a couple of lucky souls that are living in Egypt, Helios takes the reins of his chariot away from Phaethon and starts driving again. Things return to normal. There's a reference to this story within Manilius. He talks about this, and he says like this is what the Pythagoreans say the Milky Way is. And as we'll see, Plato is borrowing a lot from the Pythagoreans, and probably his source for this being a Pythagorean text was coming from Plato's Timaeus. That is one of the very, very few surviving sources that actually talks about this story at all. There's this beautiful quote where he says that we perceive our creator of whom we are part. That's also something that shows up in the Timaeus. We rise to the stars whose children we are. There's another Timaeus reference. Can one doubt that a divinity dwells within our breasts and our souls return to the heaven whence they came? This is this is not a traditional Roman perspective that I know of. It seemed to be something that he was borrowing specifically from Plato, whom again Manilius would have read. Okay. So that's Manilius, and let's do our final astrologer in this sort of broad survey that we're doing of the astrological corpus. That's Porphyry. We talked about him a little bit. Again, Porphyry was an archon or a head of the Platonic school, the Platonic Academy, and he was also a vocal astrologer. He wrote this introduction to the Tetrabiblos. He writes a lot about the oikodespotes in the chart and the kurios. If you've heard of like the nautical metaphor in astrology and that kind of thing with like the captain and the helmsman and this stuff, a lot of that comes from Porphyry. And at the very least, this fact that we have a vocal astrologer who was also the head of the Platonic Academy shows that Platonists did astrology. Like that's clear. People who consider themselves to be Platonists were also doing astrology, 500 years after Plato was alive. It also shows that for the most part, the Platonic school considered these two practices to be reconcilable. At least very least compatible. And at most, it implies that astrology was a living lineage that was being passed down within the Platonic Academy, from archon to archon, maybe a couple breaks in the chain here and there that were kept alive outside of the school, but for the most part, it kept going and it was flourishing. And it just kind of spread outside of the school over time. I think taken alone, the fact that Porphyry was doing astrology doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. But I think that taken in tandem with all of the astrological implications that are already in Plato and the Platonic themes that are in Manilius and the possibility of Antiochus of Athens being an astrologer, I think it means quite a bit. It's like another level, it's another piece of evidence that taken alongside everything else, you start to get a preponderance of evidence, you start to get a burden of proof for people that want to disagree with it. They have to kind of start to explain all this away. Okay. So let's do a brief recap before we get into some of the really interesting mystical stuff. I feel like I have established at this point that there are astrological themes present within the Platonic corpus. That much is clear. Between Timaeus, the Phaedrus, the Epinomis, that is true beyond the shadow of a doubt. And I think it is also noticeable, and at least very, very interesting, that there are Platonic themes that are present within the astrological corpus. At the very least, I've intimated that this is, I think, probable. And, between Robert Schmidt's analysis of the overt application of Hellenistic doctrine to Antiochus of Ascalon and, Manilius, all the way down to Neoplatonists such as Porphyry and Proclus using astrology. It starts to get really, really interesting. It starts to become like, this is like, well, there might be something here. So now we're going to get into the really, really juicy stuff. This is where things start to get very, very interesting in my mind, is we're going to go back into the archives of Greek mysticism and even eventually Egyptian mysticism and just show how old this philosophical approach to astrology actually is. And I want to make one thing very, very clear right off the bat, is that everybody after Plato saw Plato as cribbing off the Orphics and the Pythagoreans. Everybody. We're going to be talking a lot about Orphism and Pythagoreanism here, and I just want to make it explicit that a lot of people saw, like, yeah, Plato is borrowing significantly from Orpheus and Pythagoras. Some people say Plato went to Sicily and studied with Pythagoreans that were living there. It's kind of part of the philosophical ethos. And here's a abridged list of people who say as much throughout the history of philosophy and astrology in late antiquity. But we don't listen to any of these classical astrologers because a certain kind of impoverished atheism has dominated the studies, and this impoverished atheism would anachronistically reduce Plato to the same kind of fuddy-duddy, depressed 19th century imperialist Victorian classicists that they were. It's textual violence. That's what I think it is, and that's polemical, but that's kind of where I'm at with this. We need to get back to the way that people would have viewed Plato, and probably the way that Plato viewed himself, and not try and reduce him to just being like an atheist academic, just because that's what most people who are atheist academics want him to be. It's not right, really. It's not good scholarship. So brief review. Here's, just to make it explicit, a bunch of esoteric themes that show up in the Platonic dialogues. We've seen a lot of these before. We have the fall of the soul from the stars and its reascent back to heaven. Shows up in the Phaedrus and Timaeus. They have the 7 planets as regulators of life on earth and administrators of destiny and fate. This shows up in the Timaeus and the Epinomis. We have the reincarnation of the soul into the material world, and that shows up in the Cratylus. I'll mention that a little bit later. And then the book 10 of the Republic, and the myth of if you, very much worth a read. It's a very interesting story. And then we have the use of philosophy to liberate the soul from the body. That's clearly in the Phaedrus. I should have put that there as well. It's also in the Phaedo, which is the doctrine, which is the text that is basically Socrates' last rites, last dying breath, his last conversation with his students before he's forced to drink poison hemlock. And so lots of conversations about what astrology is really doing, and the preparation for death before Socrates dies. And then book 6 of the Republic with the ascent and the myth of the cave, and then the Meno dialogue as well. We'll talk about that too. Okay. So let's start with Pythagoreanism. And so, like, in terms of timeline, we've got Plato here, and then Pythagoreanism and Pythagoras, they're like the next step back in history of Greek mystery traditions. Starting off with Empedocles, who was a Pythagorean that kind of left and started doing his own thing. Empedocles is a super interesting character. Very fast. He ended up jumping into a volcano because he thought that that was the only way that he was going to liberate his soul from his body and go back to the realm of the gods. That's commitment. I don't know if I would ever jump into a volcano, but props for him. He definitely believed what he said. And so he is the first person that we know of to write about the 4-element theory. Fire, air, earth, and water all being kind of categorized together like that. That's Empedocles. And, to say nothing about how that has affected astrology to this day, right? We're always using these 4 elements in our astrological approach, in psychology, and like classifying the planets. So Empedocles also claimed that human beings are gods who have sinned against other gods and have been cast into the material world. This is kind of like a darker version and less explicitly astral version of the story that we have within Manilius and within Plato of the descent of the stars down into the material world. Though we have seen how a lot of overlap between gods being stars and stars being gods, so it's not difficult to read that in here or see how it's implied. The reason why we were cast down is because we ate meat. And every single time we eat meat again, we extend our sentence in the material world and we extend our suffering. So if you really believe him, you should probably be a vegetarian or a vegan. He jumped into a volcano. He certainly believed his philosophy. But through purificatory practices, through philosophy, and also through not eating meat anymore and celibacy, we can go back home. We can go back into the realm of the gods. We can go back up to the stars. After being reborn for thousands of years, I think the number is 32,000 years that we have to spend on Earth if we don't eat meat. After that, we can return to our status as gods and go back home. This home thing, like that's like this idea that like our home is up there, right? That's where we come from, and that's ultimately where we're trying to get back to. And there's maybe certain things that you have to do in order to make that happen, but that's kind of our agenda. We're maybe not supposed to be down here. We're supposed to be up there. We're just trying to get back in some way. Maybe Empedocles was a Cancer. It could have been. Okay. So some other comments just about Empedocles, but also Pythagoreanism in general, is the sanctity of number. This is something that you see a lot in Plato too. Numbers and geometry are sacred. They are in some way closer to the absolutes of reality. This is kind of echoed within Plato's doctrine of the forms, where the forms, because they're absolute and they're never changing, just like number or mathematical truths, they're in some way closer to the real reality, the really real. And people think that he borrowed his idea of the forms from Pythagorean's viewpoint of number and just expanded on it quite a bit. Also, very interestingly, the completion of mathematical equations is a kind of spiritual practice. This is something that shows up in the Meno dialogue in Plato, where like the fact that you can do mathematics, the fact that you can reason in that way, you can come up with solutions, is actually proof that there is a soul within you which knows truths in themselves, and that like you don't need to memorize anything, you don't necessarily need to have an education. You can kind of like look at something and like kind of add things up or just figure things out. To Plato, that's proof, and to the Pythagoreans, that is proof that you're a transcendent being. And they would actually engage in mathematical exercises to as a kind of spiritual practice, because every single time you would do it, it would also remind you, kind of like meditation, like, oh, I'm more than this body. I sit and I meditate, I do some breath work, and I realize that I'm not just my physical being, I'm something more than that. And doing mathematics is doing a very, very similar kind of work. It'd be interesting to try and, I think if we taught children that in school, they might be more excited about doing their multiplication tables. It could be interesting on a practical level as well to reintroduce this. Also, the Pythagoreans had ascetic practices. They were vegetarians. They also didn't eat beans. They lived in monastic groups. They held everything in common. Kind of like monasteries. No physical attachment at all. Also, even like considering that the the second house in astrology was classically a bad house. It's like your material possessions are a bad thing. Is kind of evidence to the idea that astrologers were perhaps ascetic in some way, and like your aesthetic, your possessions are something that chain you, something that you don't want to have, and that's why the second house is a bad house. Okay. Plato also, yeah, has very, very few kind things to say about the body and materiality. It's something that gets you stuck in some way. So philosophy, both of the Pythagoreans and Plato, is a kind of spiritual discipline. It's a kind of ascesis meant to help your soul liberate from the body and contemplate higher things. Also, very, very interesting, explicitly astrological themes in Pythagoreanism. The Pythagoreans are downstream of Orphics. You could think of them as like more mathematical, linear-minded Orphics. And both Pythagoras and Orpheus are considered priests of Apollo, just like Socrates in the Apology, where Socrates gets his personal genius, his personal daimon, from the Oracle of Delphi, who is an oracle to Apollo. So the Pythagoreans viewed Orpheus' seven-stringed lyre as a tool to reascend up the spheres of the seven planets. Greek lyres have 7 strings, and the Pythagoreans would play the lyre in accompaniment with the intonations of the 7 Greek vowels. So if you've studied classical Greek, you know that there are 7 vowels, and there was one vowel that would correspond to each of the notes on a lyre, and naturally also to one of the 7 traditional planets. And they would do these intonations. But you could even think of them as mantra to help liberate their souls from their body, so that when they died, they could reascend up through the 7 spheres and go back to the realm of the fixed stars. There's also, when you hear people talking about the music of the spheres in Pythagoreanism, this is what they're referring to. This like correlation between the planets up there and the music that we make down here. There's a sympathy that happens. Okay, so let's get into Orphism then. So we've got Plato, Pythagoreanism, and then going even further back in history down to like the Orphics. It's very, very interesting stuff. They're a sect of Greek initiates that for them the Orpheus figure was a kind of savior type figure that would help them get back to the realm of the gods when they died. So this Sema and Soma, this is something that Plato draws on in his Cratylus dialogue, where you have the body is Sema, and then tomb is Soma. So clearly, like, a lot of asceticism, like we got to get out of the material world, we got to go back home. This is no good. And he says like this is something that the Orphics believed, and you see that like consistently emphasized in other texts that Plato writes as well, especially the Phaedo. Like physical body, no good. Got to get out of here. It's also something really interesting, the Zagreus myth. The devouring of Dionysus by the Titans. So what happens is in the Orphic cosmology, you've got the Titans, and the Titans kind of hand over the reins of control to Zeus, and then Zeus later on says, I want my son Dionysus to become the next king of the gods. And the Titans get kind of jealous about this. They're not happy with it. So what they do is they take Dionysus, they cut him up into 7 pieces, kind of gristly, but clearly an astrological connection there. Cut him up into 7 pieces, and then they cook him and eat him. But fortunately, there's like a piece of him that was preserved that Zeus was able to use to like recreate Dionysus through the body of Semele, and things worked out okay. But the Titans, according to the Orphic cosmology, the Titans are us. We did that, and we suck. We shouldn't have done that. So we're punished and sent into Tartarus. This is like a really weird way to look at things, like where we're the Titans, we're the ones who sinned against the gods, and we right now where we are is actually in Tartarus, is in hell, like even deeper than Hades. Like we're in hell, and that's not good. And this is clearly what Empedocles is referring to with the original sin of eating flesh. I don't know if anybody has made that connection before, but people like say like, how could a god eat flesh? What does that even mean? Like, well, he was working with something that the Orphics were playing on beforehand. But through mystic prayers and rites and asceticism, the soul can reascend back up to the place of the gods where we come from. There's this very, very interesting tablet called the Petalia Gold Tablet that is a list of steps that the Orphic initiate must take when they die. And doing these steps in just the proper way ensures that your spirit will go back to heaven when you die, and that you won't be reborn and reincarnated onto earth. And initiates of Orphism would be buried with these tablets around their neck. So like the idea is like it's very, very close to their body. So if their spirit needs to like check back into the tablet and see like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do next? What's my next step? They can like kind of, it'll be easier for them to recall it, or even like go back to their body and see it, so that they can be on their way and not have to be reborn again. And just as a note, we found 12 of these tablets, which is a huge deal. In paleoarchaeology, if you find 12 of anything, that's a big deal. That means that like this was not just like an isolated instance. There's a lot of people who really, really believed this and believed it enough to be actually buried with this around their neck. So this is an excerpt from it. I'm sharing this just because I think it's very interesting and even kind of beautiful. It says that you will find a spring on your left in Hades' halls, and by it the cypress with its luminous sheen. Do not go near this spring or drink its water. You will find another, cold water flowing from Memory's lake. Its guardians stand before it. Say, I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but descended from heaven. You yourselves know this. I am parched with thirst and dying. Quickly give me the cool water flowing from Memory's lake. Okay, so two things here. One, there's a very, very similar story in Plato's Myth of Error, where some souls go and they drink water from one font, from one spring, and they forget, and they go back to earth without any memory of their past lives. And then others drink from the lake of memory, and they go back into earth with memory of their past lives, and it gives them the wisdom and the insight to move forward in a good way and keep purifying themselves. Also, clearly, it's like, I'm a child of earth and starry heaven. It's the second thing. This is where we come from. We come from the stars. This is exactly what Plato is talking about in the Timaeus and the Phaedrus, and that we see also echoed in Manilius. It's this: we descend from the stars. We come from up there. We do not belong down here. And it's just a matter of trying to get back to where we came from. Yeah, clearly a very heavy theology of liberation. Just like Pythagoreanism and Empedocles, purification is a huge deal. Clear also for Plato too. They're celibate vegans. If you're talking to a celibate vegan, they're not messing around. That's like on par with jumping into a volcano. Maybe not quite at that level, but it's definitely like they take their life, they take what they believe very, very seriously. There's more of a focus within Orphism on pure music and less on mathematics and number. At least it hasn't survived. And outside of that, tablet that has been buried around 12 different people's necks, there's not a whole lot of explicit references to astrological practice, but I am sure that the Pythagoreans probably got their idea of Orpheus lyre from the Orphics. I mean, where else would it have come from? Okay. Now let's terminate this. Let's bring this to its terminal conclusion. This is kind of where I've been heading this entire time. Egypt and the pyramid texts. If you want to talk about something, like read someone else who writes about this quite a bit, there's Algish Ujdavinis, who spends a lot of time talking about the similarity between Orphism and Platonism and ancient Egyptian coffin texts and pyramid texts. So there's a lot of work that has been done on this. It just doesn't get a lot of credence in academia, unfortunately. These pyramid texts are carvings, hieroglyphic carvings into stone on walls around sarcophagi that the pharaohs were buried in. So these texts are a series of spells, and they give advice and they give instructions for what the pharaoh is supposed to do after they die, so that they can get to the stars. And in their cosmology, they're trying to get to the stars and then talk to God, and then ultimately be reborn as another pharaoh, so that they can continue to help people on Earth. It's a little bit more, you could call it almost like a bodhisattva type of approach, where it's like You're trying to live. You're not trying to escape the world. You're trying to liberate everybody from suffering. That was kind of the Egyptian approach here. So very similar to Orphism and in Pythagoreanism, the gods, it's a little bit less macabre though. The gods and humans once lived in bliss and harmony together, but the humans sinned against the gods and they left. Humanity is purged of their guilt through death. So, with soul, after just, generally just like one death, soul can go back up to the stars and go home to live with the gods, which is where they actually belong. Let's see here. This is clearly the same role as the gold tablets. Like, it's clearly not as ornate. Not everybody can be born into a pyramid with a bunch of stone inscriptions of what you need to do after you die. That's not sustainable. But one special bodhisattva each generation can. And so that's kind of the approach that they're working with. Here's a quote from the pyramid text of Teti, which is 2200 BC. That's really old. Just for perspective, at 2200 BC, there were still mammoths on the earth. Like, that's a long time ago. He says that the gatekeeper comes out to you. He grasps your hand, takes you into heaven to your father Geb. He rejoices at your coming. He gives you his hands, kisses you, caresses you, sets you before the spirits, the imperishable stars. The hidden ones worship you. The great ones surround you. The watchers wait on you, as ordered, done for you by Geb, your father. Rise up, O Teti, you shall not die. Teti was the name of the pharaoh that passed here, and is one inscription that is a clearly explicit reference to going back to the realm of the stars. And you also see that with this taking you into heaven, where like heaven, sky, there's lots of in many languages, the words for heaven and sky are exactly the same. So this idea of like going back up to the sky, going back up to the stars. It shows up again and again. This is one from the pyramid text of Unas, 2400 BC. It says, "Oh, Unas, beware of the lake. There's this thing between Plato and the waters of Lethe, of forgetfulness, and the myth of error and the Republic, and then the Orphic Pedalia gold tablet, and then the pyramid text of Unas." Be like, so here's some practical advice, everybody. When you die, if you see a pool of water somewhere, be very, very wary about drinking it. I know I will be. There seems to be kind of like a theme here. So hopefully Unas, he got the message and he didn't drink from the lake. There's some other interesting comments that I saw here around stars, just reading through it. This is all online too. Like, if you're really, really interested in Egyptology, I definitely recommend looking into the pyramid text. Very fascinating stuff. So the glorified humanity, bewail you after the imperishable stars have carried you. So the idea, like the stars come down and pull the soul back to the stars. There is no God who has become a star without a companion. Is like talking about how you need consorts, something that shows up in some different religions too. But the idea is like gods need to become stars. Look at me, you have seen the forms of the children of their fathers who are now imperishable stars. That's explicitly Platonic, right? Where in Plato, we don't just come from the stars, we are stars that have descended into the material world. Now, like they're back to being imperishable stars here. They die and they get to go back to being a star. And yeah, may you open your place in heaven amongst the stars of heaven. So it's like constant. This is why a lot of people refer to Egyptian astral theology as kind of a fixed edifice, because it shows up again, and a lot of their religion is centered around the stars. The gods are a little bit more derivative just to the stars, and getting back to the stars. Also of note is that Herodotus describes the Orphics and the Pythagoreans as wearing the exact same pure white linen garments that the Egyptian priests wore. And ostensibly, Pythagoras himself studied at Heliopolis, which is an Egyptian city sacred to the sun. The story is that he waited naked outside the gates for like a week, and they sicked the dogs on him because he was a dirty Grecian and not an Egyptian and wasn't ready to handle the mysteries. But he was persistent, and he just, nursed his wounds that the dogs gave him, I suppose, and was able to pass the test and then get the insight that he was looking for. Interesting, Pythagoras is the first individual to go by the Greek title Philosophos, which means a lover of wisdom. And Egyptian high priests and holy people were called Merek, lover of wisdom. Like, where did he get that term? Probably from the Egyptian high priest that he studied. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of information. We've gone all the way from Porphyry at 275 CE to the pyramid text of Unos at 2400 BC. We're pushing up on 2,800 years of ancient history. So if we're going to distill all of this, what do we see? We see three main themes, and I couldn't help but notice some similarity between these and like the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. So I'm calling these the thrice greatest truths in honor of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes thrice greatest, who ostensibly gave us astrology at the beginning. So the first one is this original sin. Humanity fell in some way from the realm of the stars. Whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, whether we were cast out, people disagree. But in any case, we're down here and we're not up there. And that we might not want to be that. We might not want to be here forever. So then that leads me to number two, is that liberation. If you don't want to be here, it is possible for human beings to return to the realm of the stars. You can go back. You're not stuck here forever. You're not bound to constantly being reborn again and again and again and again. And then number three is how you do that, spiritual practice. Asceticism, contemplation, and philosophy, also specifically like, mathematical practice, will bring your soul back home to the realm of the stars. It regrows your wings so that when you die, you don't just fall back to the earth, but you can actually rise up back into your chariot and course through the realms of the heavens for eternity, or at least until you fall back down again. So those are the three main themes. So this is kind of what I've argued for throughout this. Tried to show how Plato definitely influences Hellenistic astrology, but also showing how astrological mystery traditions deeply influence Plato and then in turn influence Hellenistic astrology. Getting a little bit more specific with it, here's your astrological mystery tradition.
Hey, Matthew.
Uh-huh.
Hi, I just want to give you this 3-minute notice. We've got
Okay.
3 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I'll go real quickly through what I have.
This is great. Thank you so much.
Cool. You're very welcome. So yeah, starting with Egyptian astral religion through Orphism, Pythagoreanism, Plato, Antiochus, and then Manilius, Porphyry, Neoplatonists, and so on. All of it is this current that's centered around these three thrice greatest truths. So what do we do with this? Astrology, it's a practical philosophy in my mind, practical philosophy birthed from these ancient mystery traditions. So let's go through the axiological model. You assume a particular view of the world to be true. These are known as axioms. And from that view of the world, you model a particular set of norms or rules for how to comport your life. So like this is the set theory, if you're interested, if there are any logicians here. And then, in short, ontology leads to morality. Example, Buddhism, all life is suffering. People want to end their suffering. They don't want it to continue. But in order to end suffering, you must follow the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. Therefore, you should follow the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. Here's your ontology, here's your axioms, and it leads you to a particular way to comport your life. So take that, David Hume. You can get an ought from it and is. Similar in Christianity, there is a God. God has given us the Bible. Bible says that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Therefore, you should love your neighbor as yourself. In astrology, it would go something like this. The world was created such that as above, so below is always true. More specifically, each planet and sign corresponds to a particular set of things, people, situations on Earth. The condition of the planet in the sky determines the condition of some X on Earth, and also the future condition of that planet determines the future condition of the corresponding X. So you can know what events and situations and whatnot will occur on Earth by tracking the conditions of the corresponding planets. And then you can use that knowledge to inform how you will live your life. So that's how the cosmology and the worldview laid out by the astrological mystery traditions, basically as above, so below, leads to your practice of traditional practical horoscopic astrology. And that's practical philosophy. So I'm gonna try and get these two takeaways in like less than a minute. First one is that astrology does not need to be a Western empirical science. Its roots are much more important than that. There seems to be this implicit fear that I see that if we can't provide a mechanistic explanation for astrology, it must not be real. But this mechanism isn't necessary. Where our axioms, our foundation is rooted in classical ancient mystery traditions. That's our foundation. We don't necessarily need to explain things in terms of cosmic rays or gravitational pull in order for astrology to be true. This also means that astrology can hold its own with Western empirical science. Mechanistic explanations are never actually necessary. let's see. Okay, yeah, so things in general do not require causal explanations in order to work. Did gravity, like gravity actually existed before Newton formulated laws around it. The universe doesn't care about the explanations that we give. The universe does not require a coherent explanation on our part in order to keep functioning. The sun doesn't need me to have a coherent scientific model of the rotation of the earth in order to rise each morning, nor do I need a measurement of UV rays in order for the sun to keep shining. It's a beautiful quote from Martin Heidegger, just the world worlds. Back to the axiological model. Our foundation, our origin is within the ancient mystery traditions. If you take those as your axioms, if you take those as your givens, as your starting points, then you can go very, very far. Western science has its own starting points. Every discipline has its starting points. Every discipline takes certain things for granted. There are no absolute starting points. There is no foundational bedrock for knowledge. There are only justified beginnings and unjustified beginnings. Western science has its own starting point. Scientists take for granted that experimentation is an accurate means to assessing the truth of the universe. For instance, something that many philosophers, including Aristotle and Martin Heidegger, would vehemently contest. Scientific method begins with a hypothesis, a certain belief, a proposition, a mental attitude, not some kind of epistemic bedrock rooted in reality. As astrologers, you have your own starting points, and that's fine. It's inescapable. The next time someone tells you that you're irrational for believing in astrology, ask them why they think experimentation is an accurate measurement of reality, or ask them how they know that experimentation will get them to the truth, capital T. And then also ask them why you should believe that physical reality is all there is, simply based off of instruments and microscopes that can only measure physical reality. Like, you see the circularity there? Ask them if they've ever seen justice in a microscope. Right? Like they haven't. You can't see justice in a microscope, but that doesn't mean that justice isn't true. There's this like reductionism that is like it's really, really, really insidious, and it's very, very problematic. The next time that someone bothers you about believing about being an astrologer or studying astrology, tell them that your belief in astrology is rooted in a coherent set of axioms that are non-contradictory and epistemically justified, which undergird the ontological framework that informs the practice of natal chart delineation. They will never bother you again, and all that is true. You have a coherent set of axioms rooted in an ancient mystery tradition that goes all the way back to the ancient pyramids, and just you reason from that very, very naturally into a something that actually works. So I get kind of animated about that because I feel like astrologers need protection from scientists that bother them. Third takeaway, sorry, we are going a little bit over. Third takeaway is that astrology is so much more than reading charts. It's a wisdom tradition. And it's a wisdom tradition that has stood the test of time. It's an extremely practical, effective wisdom tradition that really, really works. Again, like, compared to, like, it works just as well as Western science. You can get a lot of like prediction correct using astrology. So moving forward, I would really like to see two things happen for astrology and for astrologers. First, I would like to see people embrace the rigor and power of astrology on its own terms as a mystery school, and not necessarily trying to turn it into a science. Because, whenever in the past we've tried to turn things into sciences as astrologers, they don't go so well, and we don't look super great either, because we don't have to be that. I don't want to see any more like pandering meekly for mainstream respectability by trying to turn astrology into something that it isn't. I want us to revel in astrology for what it is, as the extremely practical arm of an ancient mystery tradition that goes back probably even beyond time itself. That's your birthright as an astrologer, to really own that. There's power there. It's a lot older than Western science. And the second thing that I would love to see moving forward is more of an incorporation for astrologers with the spiritual practices that birthed and accompanied natal astrology. So, rituals, magic, theurgy, meditation, breathwork, asceticism, and the like, using that in tandem with our own astrological practices, and also even giving them as remediations to clients. That's something that I do myself, getting a sense for like where some strengths and some trouble areas are, and then addressing that with spiritual practice. What I want to leave you with is that the natal chart is your map back to the stars. The spiritual practices actually take you there. if there's one key thing that I would like for everybody here and myself, even on a deeper level, to integrate into my own lives and also into the, into your own lives and also into the lives of your clients, this is it. This is what I'm kind of leading up to with this entire talk. Ultimately, I think that this is all that really matters, is making sure that we are, not just predicting and describing people's lives for the sake of prediction, but also giving them things that they can do that will help their spirit return home. And that's all I have. I thank you all for your time. Yeah.
Do you, by the way, do you have a slide with your contact info?
Oh yeah, I meant to do that.
Or you just let everyone know if they want to book a reading or take. I noticed you have some educational resources on your website.
Let me pull up a different slide that does have that real quick. This is a different thing. Nope, this one doesn't have it either.
That's okay.
This one doesn't. Here we go. This is a different talk that I gave. Yes, here we go. So this is me. My name is Matthew Canning. My website is www.ancientastrology.org, and you can also reach out to me through email at merlin@ancientastrology.org. That's some of my friends call me Merlin.
Wonderful. Well, this has been very comprehensive and tangible. So thank you. And you're getting a lot of, in the chat, a lot of people are saying thank you and they're so grateful. You've been very affirming, amazingly clarifying and organizing exactly what I need. Information was concise and well presented. Yeah, a lot of people loving what you presented, including me. So I'll have to do some more research. Mind blowing, getting more people commenting. Sublime, thorough. People are very excited. So we really appreciate you here. And yeah, if you all are interested in learning more with Matthew, here's his website. Or do you identify as he? Sorry.
Yes, I do.
Okay, here's his website and email. So yeah, a lot of people. Yes, and someone asked, do you teach? And I think I know the answer, but do you want to answer that? Okay, cool.
Yeah, I teach. I generally go onto platforms that people invite me onto, and I also provide tutoring services for people who want to learn astrology from somebody one-on-one. I have a curriculum that I walk people through as well.
Wonderful. So yeah, if people want to check that out, go to the website, and also you will be getting a copy of this recording within the week, everyone. So thank you again, Matthew, for your time and this incredibly profound presentation.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was truly my pleasure. I'm glad that everyone enjoyed it so much.